And after a decade of development, BRICS accounts for around a quarter of the world's total economic output, thanks to a growth spurt in trade and investments. Should BRICS nations have as much influence in global governance as the G7? Joining me to discuss this is Ravi Ramamurti. He's a professor and director for the Center for Emerging Markets at Northeastern University. Professor, we've heard President Xi say the 5 BRICS countries should really speak with one voice. How realistic is that when their economies are also different from one another?
Yeah, it is going to be difficult for them to speak with one voice. I mean, there are certain issues in which they may be able to have a consensus, or if the language of the consensus is sufficiently vague, they may be able to agree on some platitudes. But when it gets to very specific things, it's going to be more difficult. And as the years progress, I think it will be even harder for the countries to speak with one voice. Let's not forget that the BRICS was a completely artificial creation by someone in Goldman Sachs who thought it was a good idea to recognize the growing importance of 4 very different emerging markets that were becoming important on the world stage. That became then the basis for creating this annual meeting of the heads of state of these countries. Now, the meeting is serving many useful purposes. I don't think we should judge it just by the extent to which they can agree on certain policies. But in terms of your question, yeah, I do think it'll be difficult.
Let me ask you a specific question about Brazil, mired in political scandals, facing its worst recession in history. So how vital is Brazil's domestic stability and prosperity for BRICS and really the rest of the world?
Well, Brazil is a very important economy. It is half the South American economy. So and the reason why it's part of the BRICS is because it is one of the top 4 emerging economies. But Brazil has not been a high-growth economy, and this is, again, one of the problems with the creation of this club called the BRICS. They are very different in terms of their potential for growth, in terms of their per capita income when they became part of the club, and also the extent to which they're commodity-driven economies. So you have Russia and Brazil still being very commodity-driven economies, and China, India being less so, and South Africa is somewhere in between. So Brazil is struggling with some of the problems many emerging markets are dealing with these days, which is falling prices of commodities and falling demand or slow rates of growth of increase in demand, particularly because of the slowing down in China. So I think Brazil is going through a difficult economic time, which has been further compounded by its political problems.
Professor, quickly, I want to ask you about President Trump's America First agenda. How do you think that would impact BRICS' growing influence, versus the G7?
Now, that is, I think, a fundamental long-term shift that is taking place. It's happening in slow motion, so sometimes we miss it. But I do think there is a kind of changing of the guards in the process of unfolding. The U.S. is pulling back, becoming a little bit more inwardly focused and more isolationist. The emerging economies, on the other hand, are eager to expand globalization, eager to expand trade, become more open, encourage foreign direct investment, and so on. So we've seen a complete reversal of the roles that the developed countries and the emerging economies historically used to play, which was the developed countries were for globalization and openness, and the developing countries were for the opposite. Today, you have China getting up on the world stage and speaking about the merits of openness and globalization.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Professor Ramamurti, thank you so much.